Hello, I'm Nicholas Cronk. I'm the director of the Voltaire Foundation in Oxford, and it's a huge pleasure to welcome you to this Song Connections event on Voltaire, Rousseau and the Enlightenment. The Voltaire Foundation is a department in Oxford that specialises in the study of the French Enlightenment, and in particular we've published the complete correspondence of Rousseau in 50-odd volumes, and we're just about to finish next year the first ever complete printing of the whole of Voltaire's writings. It's the edition behind me, and next year we'll publish the 203rd and final volume. So we think a lot about the writings of these great philosophes, but in today's event we're going to think about their interest in song. Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau are two of the most important thinkers of the French Enlightenment. Indeed, you'd have to say the European Enlightenment, because both of them were celebrities in their lifetimes. Celebrities meaning that they were very famous all across Europe, even by people who hadn't read their books. They were also famous for being enemies. So it's important at the Voltaire Foundation that we have Voltaire and Rousseau together, reconciled maybe, on the mantelpiece at the Voltaire Foundation. The image of Voltaire is a very famous image, it's an iconic image. It's the bust that was sculpted by Houdon just after he died, and it's a very famous image of Voltaire's slightly tight-lipped smile. The image of Rousseau, on the other hand, is not a familiar one. This is a very special portrait that's only been exhibited once. This is a portrait of Rousseau that was painted when he was in England. Rousseau is famous, of course, nowadays as a political theorist. The Social Contract is still a hugely important text. He's famous as an autobiographer, that Rousseau's Confessions are one of the key works of Western literature in terms of self-examination. But he's also, and that we tend to forget, he was important as a musicologist and as a composer. He wrote a lot about music. He composed a number of operas, one of which, Le Devin du Village, was performed at court in front of Louis XV in 1752, and was an enormous success. So much so the king offered Rousseau a life pension. Being a Rousseau, he refused it. Rousseau was always a difficult person. In 1765, he published The Social Contract and got into a lot of political hot water. His friend Hugh invited him to come to London. He arrived in London with his mistress and his dog in January 1766. He was feted in the capital for several weeks, which he didn't entirely like, and then he left London and went to his refuge, which is a beautiful house that was lent to him at Wootton in Staffordshire. En route, by the way, between London and Staffordshire, he must have come, if not to Oxford, he passed near Oxford, because he stayed with the Earl Harcourt at Newnham, where he left some engravings and some writings. This portrait was almost certainly painted when Rousseau was at Wootton, quite possibly for one of the intellectuals whom he met or whom he frequented at that time. What's really interesting about it is that it shows Rousseau in a very relaxed pose, obviously. 18th century gentlemen could be painted in their wigs. If you didn't wear a wig, you were painted in a more relaxed pose of this headgear. But the key element for our purposes, I think, is the fact there's a sheet of music here. And this is clearly a reference to the fact that the English were very familiar with the Devin du Village, which was first performed in London just a few years before Rousseau came, in a translation by Charles Burney. So this is another great treasure we have at the Voltaire Foundation, a painting of Voltaire from the end of his life. Voltaire has an incredibly busy life. He publishes an enormous number of books, the 203 volumes I mentioned earlier, and he moved around a great deal. He was born in Paris, he died in Paris, but actually lived very little in Paris. He would love to have been at court more, but he was not on the whole favoured by Louis XV. At one point in his life, he went to the court of Frederick the Great, where he lived in the early 1750s, but they ended up quarrelling as well. Voltaire travelled to Holland, he came to England in the early 1720s. It was a very restless life in a way, until in the 1750s, when he was already in his 60s, he went to Switzerland, he lived in Lausanne and then in Geneva, where he wrote some of his most famous books, including Candide. Geneva was a good centre because it was a great publishing centre and had been since the Reformation. So it enabled him to communicate to the rest of Europe through the medium of print. And then in the late 1750s, he buys a house at Ferney, the Château de Ferney. And he lives there really from the late 50s until he dies in 1778. And those last 20 years of his life are a key period. He is then the most famous living writer in Europe, and he's widely known as the Patriarch of Ferney. And this is very much a characteristic image of the Patriarch of Ferney. And this painting by a Genevan painter, Jean Hubert, shows Voltaire having a dinner party with all the leading philosophers of the age. For example, that's Diderot. In fact, it's a piece of total fiction. Diderot never went to Ferney, nor did most of the others. So this is something that Voltaire perhaps dreamed about. It was his imagined dinner party where all the philosophers came together around his dinner table. I think the key thing that links it with music is really the idea of sociability. What you see here is Voltaire talking with the other philosophers. They're not all men, there is one woman present around the table, so it's slightly mixed company. And this gives the sense of the Enlightenment living through sociability. And that, I think, is a link also to the songs that we're going to hear soon, because although Voltaire wasn't committed to the study of music in the way that Rousseau was, he was very committed to the idea that some of his poems were set to music. He also wrote librettos for Rameau. He was very pleased that one of his verse poems was set as an opera comique. Voltaire saw music as a means of spreading his writing. It was perhaps a rather utilitarian view, but he saw that in the sociability of 18th century society, music played a very important role. And that's a very important way of thinking about his presence in song. Well, here we are in the absolutely magnificent interior of Queen's College Library. This is one of the great Baroque interiors of Oxford. It was built in the 1690s, and in the history of Oxford libraries, it's the last one that has what we think of as the medieval layout, where the bookcases project into the room. All the later Enlightenment libraries will have the books against the wall, and this has a very special feeling. It's medieval in style, but it's actually the beginning of the Enlightenment. And this is a very famous interior with the carvings and the fantastic plasterwork. It's all been restored in the last few years, and it's looking absolutely fantastic. And it's a real privilege to be able to listen to music in this context today. It's a very special space also for me. I'm a student of Queen's College, so I remember sitting here sometimes when I was a student reading the books. And one of the books I read was the Encyclopedia. At the top of the stairs, we have this big run of folio volumes. This is the first edition of the Encyclopedia edited by Diderot and d'Alembert. And the editors of this encyclopedia, this great monument of Enlightenment learning, the editors asked Rousseau to write most of the articles on music. So I thought one way we could begin to think about the music we're going to hear is to look at Rousseau's article on song, chanson. And in volume 3, which is this one here, Rousseau writes, chanson est une espèce de petit poème fort court. So a song is a sort of very short poem to which a tune is added. It's a very interesting balance there, that it's a poem to which the tune is added. And it's designed to be sung in family occasions, at table with friends, or even on one's own as a diversion from work. The song, says Rousseau, is an object that makes village songs preferable to more learned compositions. And that's a very Rousseau-esque Enlightenment take on the simplicity of song.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Aspden. I'm a member of the Faculty of Music at Oxford. I work on 18th century music, Italian and English, but also a little bit of French. And I wanted to pick up on something that Nicholas was just talking about with regard to Rousseau's definition of chanson. He talked at the end about chanson being something that is more appropriate to a kind of village or a pastoral setting than to an urban setting or a courtly setting. And I have the perfect image here from the 1760s, 1770s of just such an occasion, and typically it's a miniature. So this is the way that those sorts of events were depicted in the art of the period. They were miniature paintings. This one shows a hurdy-gurdy player, or actually no, I think he's a bagpipe player, with at his feet a little puppet set, a little marionette set, which he's operating in the form of a one-man band with a foot pedal, and there are children lying around him watching entranced, and there's another musician off to one side playing what looks like an oboe to scare a dog away. So that sense of village musical life, which Rousseau felt so strongly about, is represented here not by singing, but by instrumental playing. And that in itself might be quite telling, because the 18th century is not a period that we think of as the century of song in the way that the 19th century is. And that's kind of odd. It's not because they weren't developed or sophisticated enough. The 17th century had wonderful and very ornate and rich and complex settings of song, as of course did the 19th century. But in the 18th century, there was more interest in clarity, in text setting, in simplicity. So something like this volume, which is called The Musical Entertainer, from 1738. The songs in it are representative of the time. They're really simple. You have a kind of single stave with the vocal line at the top and a bass, a figured bass accompaniment, and then you have a little part for the flute, or sometimes for another instrument, but typically for the flute, down at the bottom here. And you can see that it's a very simple song with subsequent strophes to be sung to the same music. That's absolutely standard throughout most of the 18th century. You don't get a song with developed accompaniment, with developed right-hand parts, as we would see it for keyboard. Even though this is realized for keyboard, you're meant to realize it, to create it for yourself, rather than to follow the carefully thought out musical plan of a composer like a Schubert, for example. So the other reason, of course, why song was perhaps not in the ascendant in this period is because of the rise and the dominance of opera. And it's interesting that two of the songs that we're going to choose to perform for you are indeed taken from operas. So one by Rameau and then one by Rousseau. The Rameau is from La Princesse de Navarre from 1745. It was a comédie ballet, and it's a setting of Voltaire. So it's one of the very few Voltaire operas that were set during the mid-18th century. And then also Rousseau, Rousseau's Le Devin du Village is very, very different in musical style. So I want to talk a little bit about both of those pieces. But just to show you as well that across Europe, that kind of interest in musical simplicity that Rousseau describes is present. Immediately following that very simple piece in The Musical Entertainer by Dr. Green, this is Florimel, which in itself was from A Little Musical Entertainment, there's an Italian aria, Tamo Tanto, by Handel, but again, given a very simple setting with the flute accompaniment at the bottom. And these kinds of simple Handel pieces made it into song repertoire where the more complex Handel pieces did not. We've just heard Rousseau's J'ai perdu tout mon bonheur, sung by Colette in Le Devin du Village of 1752, which was a work that Rousseau wrote quite quickly between March and May 1752. And it was a turning point for Rousseau. It marked his realization, following a Damascene moment he'd had a few years earlier, that he needed to write musical works that put into effect his philosophy, his idea of making society better, in part through his art. And what was really important to Rousseau was the unity of music and text. This was, of course, something that opera composers, opera librettists had been aiming for since the very beginning of opera in the late 16th, early 17th century. And there was a constant sense with operatic history that it was deviating away from that purity and simplicity. So here's Rousseau once again going back to that idea of achieving the perfect unity of music and text through simple means. And he chose to do that in Devin du Village, partly as a shot across the bows of the most famous composer, French composer of this period, who was Jean-Philippe Rameau. Rameau was a great opera composer. He had absolutely revolutionized French opera after a kind of period of ossification from Lully's death. So Rameau came in, took over in the 1730s, 1740s, and produced really harmonically striking music, but it was seen by Rousseau as too complex. And so the kind of music that he writes in Devin du Village, which is a pastoral story about two lovers and a soothsayer who supposedly tries to reconcile them, this story that he writes is designed as a rebuke to the complexity of French musical style as he saw it at this time. It was supposedly more in the Italian vein, the comic Italian vein, rather than the serious Italian vein. Now, for French critics, this was a real shock. Not only was Rameau loved, but also they typically saw the Italian music as too artificial, too serious, too ornate, and the French music, including the French opera of Rameau, as more appropriate to the text, as more honest to the text. So for Rousseau to come in and say, no, Rameau's no good, and it's actually Italian comic opera that we should be listening to if we want to get sincerity across, was quite revolutionary, quite a shock, and created a great furore and a great argument between Rameau, who is dragged into this conversation, and Rousseau. What we're going to hear now is a wonderful aria by Rameau, Vent Furieux, from La Princesse de Navarre of 1745. It's the comedy ballet that he wrote with Voltaire, a kind of response to Molière and Lully in some ways of the late 17th century. So here they are in 1745 writing this for a royal wedding celebration. And the aria is in typical Italianate style. In fact, it's called an ariette. That's what the French did when they wanted to mark something that was in the Italian style. And this ariette is highly ornate. It's everything that the French had traditionally criticized but secretly loved. And so it's paradoxical even within itself, because what the character, one of the Graces, is singing about is getting rid of the furious winds and the tempests. But in doing so, she uses word painting for the fury of the winds and the raging of the tempests to create this colourful musical text. So, Nicholas, I wonder if I can talk to you with your Voltaire hat on, as it were, and pick your brains about how Voltaire fits into the musical life of his time. He's known today, as he was known, I think, at the time, for his wit, for political satire, for philosophical perspicacity. Where do you think writing lyric poetry fits into that view of Voltaire?
Voltaire is, I think, first of all, a man of the written word. I'm afraid he doesn't really like music. I'm afraid to say that. He doesn't really like the visual arts. So he's not like Rousseau at all. He's a man of the written word. On the other hand, he likes all written words in all genres. So he's famous, of course, as a playwright, as a satirist, but very famous in his lifetime as a poet. He's an epic poet. He's a comic poet. He writes lots of salon verse. That's not a genre that's perhaps very much prized nowadays, but it was hugely popular in the 18th century. If you were a close friend of Voltaire's, you often got a little poem from Voltaire for your birthday or to celebrate the birth of your child. Poetry was a social activity. And that might lead us perhaps into song at a certain point, because I think that he uses verse the way that other people perhaps use song or other musical forms in social settings. So I think that's the connection, maybe.
That sense of conviviality that's present in Rousseau's definition of chanson is present for Voltaire, but not necessarily in the lyric genre.
Yes,
so what's the lyric genre associated with in the 18th century?
Well, I think that there are people who write lyrics for songs, but I think I'm right in saying that probably song lyric itself is not a very highly prized form of poetry writing. I think that will change probably later on. So that Voltaire on the whole is not very often set. Occasionally he's set, and when a composer publishes a collection of songs, they often will have one poem of Voltaire's, and his name is normally printed in capital letters because it's rather special, so it's seen as exceptional to have even Monsieur de Voltaire, the most famous living writer, who contributes a poem, but he wasn't seen primarily as a song librettist, but he is certainly associated with it. And
is the lyric genre then more kind of pastoral, more love poems set in a kind of Arcadian?
Yes, I mean there certainly is a lyric tradition of Arcadian poetry. It's not partly deriving also from previous centuries. It's not always the most interesting. Probably the most characteristic 18th century voice is really slightly more ironical, slightly edgy, a bit more sort of interesting and provocative in a sense. And of course that sort of slightly edgy lyric is not really what ideally works when set to music. So I think probably you've got to wait to the Romantics, really, the late 18th or early 19th centuries, to get the sort of poetry that really lends itself to setting. But at that point, of course, there's then a different symbiosis between the poet and the composer, I suppose.
Yeah, it's interesting because Voltaire is interested in opera, even though he says to one of his acquaintances in the sort of 1730s or whatever that opera's the place that everyone goes to without really understanding why they're going there. So it's one of a typical Voltairean bon mot. But he does write operas, they're just not very successful. But as with lyric, he gets picked up in the very late 18th century and into the 19th century, and it's his tragedies that get picked up to be set as operas because their melodramatic quality lends themselves, as you were saying, with regard to his poetry, to the romantic aesthetic rather than to a sort of much more rational or our typical idea of the Enlightenment.
And all those bel canto operas that we know, with Rossini, Semiramide, Tancredi, those are all Voltaire operas. They're all Voltaire tragedies.
Reset as operas.
Reset as operas. Yeah. And so in a curious way, his classical tragedies work very well in early 19th century Italy in another sort of neoclassical genre.
And so it's interesting that the settings that we're hearing in today's concert programme are also late 18th century and 19th century, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think the other thing one can say about Voltaire is that he was a celebrity writer. I mean, his name was European-wide, if not global, and he was always interested in any activity that promotes his name. So he particularly dislikes the opera comique, which he thinks is a loathsome sort of new invention of the 18th century. But when someone offers to turn one of his contes into an opera comique, he's terribly enthusiastic because it's his name on the stage. So I think although he doesn't particularly like music, and he certainly doesn't like the opera comique, he likes the idea that he's present as an author, appearing in all these different stages, all these different publics. So for him, to be frank, it's more about sociability and celebrity than it is about music as such.
Okay, and so now we're going to hear one of those later 18th century settings of Voltaire that capitalize on the celebrity. Actually, just what you were you were saying about Voltaire's interest in his celebrity. He does become an international celebrity, doesn't he? I mean, just taking on that nom de plume, Voltaire, and he's known by that single name throughout Europe. What do you think that does to the potential for setting Voltaire in the 19th century?
Well, of course, the name continues through the 19th century. The celebrity goes on. So there's always there is a certain star quality in using that name. It's certainly absolutely right, yeah.
And that's why, presumably, he gets translated by Pushkin.
Yeah, so going back to something we said earlier about his salon poetry, a lot of the light verse is something which is hard for us to understand. These are verses that were enjoyed among a very small group of people. Sometimes they even have in-jokes. It's not poetry for the grand stage. It's poetry that creates social intimacy. And that's something that isn't obvious to later centuries. But Voltaire was a master of this particular genre. And just one or two of the poems really, really interested other poets, even other great poets. So there's one example which does get into the song repertoire, which is a song called A Dream. And it's a madrigal. I can gloss it a little bit because you're going to hear this sung in a minute. It's a poem that Voltaire wrote for a German princess at the court of Potsdam in the 1740s. And of course, he has to pretend to be in love with her because that's what you did. And the gist of the poem is that sometimes truth and lies get mixed up. Last night, I had a dream, and of course, the dream was full of unrealities. But in this dream, I was a king, I had an empire, and I told you, princess, that I loved you. And then I woke up and I'd lost everything. But I hadn't lost everything because the gods only took away my empire. I still love you. Okay, this is turned in French very, very beautifully. Souvent, un peu de vérité se mêle au plus grossier mensonge. Cette nuit, dans l'erreur d'un songe, au rang des rois, j'étais monté. Je vous aimais, princesse, et j'osais vous le dire. Les dieux, à mon réveil, ne m'ont pas tout ôté. Je n'ai perdu que mon empire. I mean, it's fantastically well turned, a conceit that's brilliantly expressed, very fluent. This was simply a poem that he wrote for the princess. It wasn't immediately published. It eventually got into print. 20 years later, but only after 20 years, it begins to be included in his complete works. So it does begin as a sort of private communication. Once it got into the published works, people thought it was really rather good. Goethe, later on, rewrites this poem in German. Pushkin, another rather considerable lyric poet, rewrites this in Russian as, forgive my Russian, snovidenia, which means dream. And a bit unexpectedly, Pushkin's snovidenia, but it's actually Voltaire, is then set in the Russian 19th century no less than 4 times by Cui, Arensky, Glazunov, and Rimsky-Korsakov. So although we don't think of Voltaire being part of the 19th century song repertoire, there is just one slightly odd example where he accidentally creeps in through the back door via Pushkin. Yeah,
and it's interesting, isn't it, that it is the typical kind of love poem or feigned love poem that he presumably generally wasn't interested in writing. But it's also kind of interestingly Shakespearean with that conceit of death and loss and going on and dream but your love surviving for posterity in some senses through the poetic art, even though he doesn't make that explicit in the way that Shakespeare does. And of course, Shakespeare was the kind of competitor in a sense for a number of
It's a very simple idea, but I think there's probably enough there that a composer can do something with it and give it. There's enough that's suggestive that you can play with.
How much interest or truck do you think that Voltaire had with Rousseau's ideas about melody and the origin of language? Yeah. And therefore the need for simplicity in French song?
Yes. I think, to be honest, I think he had no interest at all. I mean, I think that he wasn't fundamentally interested in music, and I think his default mode was to go back to the French 17th century. He thinks that French culture under Louis XIV arrived at a sort of pitch of perfection from which it can hardly get better. This is not a very good news story for Louis XV, who can never quite live up to Louis XIV, and Louis XV hates Voltaire. But I think, and of course, temperamentally, he doesn't like Rousseau. I said earlier that Voltaire was a great celebrity of the French Enlightenment. There are two great celebrities of the French Enlightenment, and the other one is Rousseau. And each one constructs a sort of posture which is almost in opposition to the other. So Voltaire is the great man who sort of speaks truth to power, but also tries to be obliging in society and so on. Rousseau is the man who tells the truth, however much it hurts people, and he's quite deliberately offensive. And so each one constructs an authorial image almost against the other. So they sort of need each other, even as they attack each other. So
it's kind of ironic, isn't it, that Les Consolations, from which we're hearing three songs, set such store, and obviously it was published posthumously, but it courts those very establishment figures that Rousseau thumbed his nose at during his life. So
I think The Consolations is a really interesting book and probably hasn't been looked at enough. So Rousseau, of course, wrote operas, as you said earlier, but he also wrote these songs. And he dies in 1778, and 3 years later, this book of Rousseau's songs is published. It's a very handsome book. The preface claims, written by his friends, and they say he left these songs in manuscript, so we thought you'd like to see them, rather modest. The book is financed, rather interestingly, by subscription. That was quite a common thing, both in London and in Paris in the 18th century. So you announce a future publication, and people sent their money in advance. And then you print the list of subscribers at the beginning of the book. But this is quite something. The first subscriber is the Queen, Marie Antoinette, and that's really, you have to be quite well connected to do that. And then if you look at the other subscribers, it's amazing. It includes Gluck, it includes Benjamin Franklin, great American lover of the European Enlightenment. So just the presence of those names suggests an extraordinary solidarity around Rousseau, who'd been so controversial really in his lifetime. The book itself is a gesture of Enlightenment beneficence, because there'd been a certain amount of quarrelling about Rousseau having been unfair to his children or having neglected his children. Voltaire in particular turns the knife in that wound. This book is presented with a frontispiece where you see Rousseau surrounded by adoring children, and the profits of the volume were to go to an orphanage. So in other words, the whole gesture of this publication is to help the poor children. And the songs are, well, we're going to hear some of the songs, of course, and they include settings of some quite prominent poets. So this is really upping the ante a bit. This is not just having rather minor authors of lyric. There are some substantial names here, including, we're going to hear, Petrarch and Metastasio.
So Metastasio, interesting. I have a little duodecimo volume of Metastasio here, designed. It's one of a set of 12. These were published. Metastasio was the other great literary figure of the 18th century, but great because of his operas. And it's designed to just slip into your pocket and pull out at salons and dinner parties and read if you can manage the very fine print under candlelight. So that sort of sense of great figures also being part of daily discourse is really quite important, I think, for Metastasio, but also for Voltaire and Rousseau. And what's interesting to me about Les Consolations is the musical setting. The musical settings are quite varied and quite rich. So some of them say that they're for harp. At least one of the settings that we're going to hear says originally for harp, although obviously can be played on other instruments. And there are other kinds of arrangements possible. And if we contrast that with the volume that I talked about earlier, the musical entertainer from 1738, where all you have is a simple bass line, there's a sense of not just investment in Rousseau's reputation through his subscribers, but also an investment in the music itself and in musical settings that do something with the text. And the settings, two of the songs we're hearing are called romance. And the romance, I wonder if you'd like to say a bit about the romance as a literary term in the 18th century.
Well, of course, it's one of those terms that means lots of different things, but I think in the 18th century, it's often used to be something simple, of course, isn't it? It's often used to be something that is at least allegedly simple, and of course, romance often, therefore, in the vernacular language rather than in some learned foreign language. There's an interesting ambiguity there, though, because romance was also, in other contexts, is used to describe the novel in the 18th century. But of course, that's a novel, that's a genre that's really rising in the sort of bourgeois, middle class environments. It's not unusual in 18th century novels, English and French, to find songs included in the fiction.
Yeah.
There's a famous example in Richardson's Clarissa, which has an engraved song in the middle. Many French 18th century novels have songs, often called romance, as part of the action. And there are many 18th century French novels where actually the score is then included and can be sort of folded out from the novel. And you imagine the reader of the novel, maybe a lady reader, who then sits at her spinet. And the music is normally quite simple, so well within the bounds of an amateur. And the reader of the novel then also sort of further understands the psychology of the heroine by playing her song.
Yeah.
So it's real reader participation.
Yes, well, of course, the novel is a very interesting topic. We could talk about separately in the epistolary novel of the earlier 18th century, involving the reader through reading the letters and so on. I think the other interesting thing to say about the romance is simplicity, absolutely, but also antiquity. And I think that's very specifically invoked in Rousseau's Les Consolations, that the preface talks about the kind of antiquity of the authors that Rousseau has chosen to set. This relates to what you were saying about setting Petrarch. And although he's not trying to achieve a particularly antique musical style, there is that sense, again, of simplicity and adherence to the old ways in his musical settings that was part of Rousseau's life. So I think we'll hear another of those now.
one thing that was occurring to us I was listening to was, of course, that we started at the top of the stairs with Rousseau, Chanson, Village, etc. And now we're talking about antiquity and simplicity. In fact, so in a way he has his cake and he eats it. And in a way it's not a paradox, but it's a paradox, but it's not inconsistent entirely, is it? That he wants something that's antique, but also modern, simple, villageois. I think there's a sort of, he's trying to have it both ways, but there's a sort of...
I think there's an assumption...
artful simplicity, maybe.
There's a realization certainly from the 16th century onwards, that antiquity, authentic antiquity, is unachievable. Mm-hmm. So one is going to achieve an approximation of the antiquity that suits the sort of modern style. I mean, it's rather like the aesthetics of La Belle Nature. You don't go for nature in its original imperfect form, you beautify it.
Yeah.
And the same goes with antiquity, certainly in operatic history, and I think probably in musical history more generally. If you look at other musical settings, say musical settings of folk songs, composers have no problem rearranging the accompaniment, improving them to make them into something more palatable to modern tastes. So actually we might just want to follow that up by thinking about why art song is seen as something that the 18th century didn't really do, wasn't really interested in. I wondered if you had any thoughts on why that might have been the case.
I suppose working backwards, we think of the 19th century song as something where there's a special fusion of poetry and composer, or maybe where the composer thinks that she can improve in some sense the text or explore the text more. I think in the 18th century there's a little bit more the sense that the text is primary and then the musician comes almost in an ancillary position. We saw that a little bit in Rousseau's definition of the song, where he said it was a poem to which you added the tune. So maybe there isn't quite that idea to have a sort of syncretism between the arts. Is that partly the explanation? And then another explanation might also be that the love poetry is either very simple, shepherds and shepherdesses saying "I love you," or it's ironical and a bit caustic or a bit sarcastic. They're not obviously great texts to set to music. I think that Schubert and Schumann wanted slightly more sophisticated love poetry.
Yes, or I think that where they are good texts to set to music, they're often set as mini dramas. So you will have more than one character, or you'll have them set as a mix of recitative and aria. And what happens with the sophistication of 19th century song is that they're able to enfold those different narrative styles within a single song setting, rather than having to break them down into separate units and turn them into a cantata. I think something else that's worth bearing in mind is that in this period, they did have an interest in songs, and not just in the sort of pastoral love song, but also in folk song. So there was a growing interest in the national style, whatever that national style might be. Of course, from the late 17th century, there's this big debate between French and Italian culture that's mainly run by the French, but they're very explicitly thinking about national differences there. And in England, there's, I suspect, a kind of increasingly urbanized nostalgia for rural purity, which also manifests itself as an interest in Scots song and Irish song. So it's, as with Rousseau, looking to antiquity, looking to the past. And then when we go into the 19th century, I think that interest in folk song, so the very simple folk song that you get in the 18th century, turns into something more sophisticated and into these grand dramas that you get in nationalist opera. But perhaps also in song settings, there's an appetite for singing those kinds of nationalist songs. So I think if we go back to the Pushkin setting, it's interesting that that these composers, these Russian composers, are setting Pushkin. They're not setting Voltaire, right?
Absolutely. And Pushkin for them was the great, I think, their great national poet. So it was an act of royalty to set Pushkin.
Great.
as it was perhaps for German composers to set the great German pace.
Yeah, well, yes, although, of course, ironically, Goethe didn't really want to be set by Schubert precisely because of what you were saying about overdevelopment of the musical side and not enough pure poetry.
So we go back to where we started. Rousseau's song is for the villageois, for the villagers.
Absolutely, but now I think we should hear some of that nationalist sentiment with Russian settings of Pushkin.
Te piemena lisci